Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for coming to tonight's event, which is a part of our current exhibition. Tomorrow was a montage. My name is Sophia Hao, and I'm a curator of Cooper Gallery here. And today I'm delighted to welcome Professor Andrzej Klimowski to be here with us, all the way come up from London to give this talk on montage in Polish contemporary art. And I'm going to do a very brief introduction about Andrzej, and is that right? Andrzej, yeah. I'll try to pronounce as a proper Polish pronunciation, and I've been practicing this afternoon. And so Andrzej Klimowski studied painting at St. Martin's School of Art, that's in London, but later on he went to Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts. And from 73 to 1980s, Andrzej lived actually in Poland, in Warsaw, and designing theatre and film posters, and also contributed illustrations and designs for book publishers. And he also designed film titles for Polish TV around that time, and made experimental short films himself. So from 81, Andrzej moved back to London and worked as a designer, illustrator, and author of a number of graphic novels, and some of them actually we have them in our library. We have one example here. We also have 3 or 4 Andrzej's graphic novels, amazing graphic novels actually, and some illustrated philosophical books on Walter Benjamin and Kant. Very interesting, and I had the pleasure, had a scan already. So if you're interested, you can find all these books in our library. And also, Andrzej has been a recipient of many international prizes, including the Hollywood Reporter Key Arts Awards for Best Film Posters, and DA&D Silver Award for a Royal Mail Millennium Stamp, and the V&A Illustration Award for the graphic novel Horace Holland, actually that's in our library, and also 12th International Biennale of Theatre posters in Poland in 2009. Andrzej works in, his work actually is in public collections of major museums, including National Museum in Warsaw and National Museum in Poznan, and the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and also Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And Andrzej, of course, exhibited worldwide. Andrzej also taught in several art schools in the UK and across Europe, and most recently he was a professor at RCA. He's now a professor emeritus. Andrzej actually still working on some graphic novels and books, and recently just published a biographical novel. And is it already released?
Yes, it's a book which I worked on with my wife. We've done 4 books together now, and this one's called Behind the Curtain, about our times in living and working as artists in Poland.
So you will have a launch actually in Poznan next year for the book?
Well, there'll be a special meeting with the audience and talking about the book at the Animation Film Festival, Animator.
Okay, great. So now I'll pass you on to Andrzej.
Well, thank you very much, Sophia. Good evening, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Dundee. I've been here before as an external examiner at the art school, so I know it quite well, and I very much admire the school and its long history. This exhibition is very exciting, and the subject to me is very exciting because I've always been interested in montage and collage, and some of the artists that you see here have had a great influence on me. And I'd like to say that although in Poland, I mean, collage, photo montage, is really very much a 20th century sort of phenomenon. It's a way of working liked by many artists, starting from the Surrealists and the Dadaists through the Constructivists in mainland Europe. And of course, Poland was very much influenced by these movements. So there was quite a lot of montage and collage work going on in between the wars. But I'll focus mainly on what happened in the 60s, in 1950s, 1960s, because I think that was a kind of breakthrough in collage and photomontage, particularly in design work, in graphics. Two artists, and I'll show you their third film, but their most important film, called Walerian Borowczyk and Jan Lenica. They started off as painters, as satirical artists, designers of film posters, and decided to make a few experimental films. And for them, everything was possible. They kind of wanted to go back to what they said. They admired Georges Méliès, the pioneer filmmaker in France at the beginning of the 20th century. You may have seen, some of you may have seen Hugo Cabret by Martin Scorsese. That was very much about Méliès, a sort of magician filmmaker. And this film called Dom, The House, is a typical example of montage. I won't tell you anything about it because it'll spoil the fun, but I'll put it on and hopefully it will work. Okay, not a very good slide, but that's Borowczyk on the left and Lenica on the right during the filming of the piece. These kind of this is Poland in the 1950s, bleak, grey. The streets were not particularly attractive. This is Warsaw. And you could still see the scars from the Second World War, missing buildings. But one thing which did really brighten up the city were posters. In fact, initially it was film posters and then it was theater posters. They wanted to produce posters which were different to the commercial American film posters that were produced in the West. And they kind of succeeded. This is a poster by Jan Lenica, one of the filmmakers, for Alban Berg's Wozzeck, which was based on the famous play about a soldier going mad. And you can see that they're very different to the kind of posters we would see in Paris or in London or New York. Very expressive. The whole idea was that the designers would be rendering their own expressions, their own interpretations of the theme. They would read the scenario, listen to the music in case of an opera poster, and work towards creating some kind of metaphor, visual metaphor or symbol, which was a reflection of their interpretation of the piece. And they were painterly. Most of the posters at the beginning really had their roots in painting, as you can see from this sketch, first of all, and here is Lenica actually working on it. So all the posters were actually painted by hand, not even to scale, but same size. Later, when reproduction was perfected, they could work to scale. So it was a very painterly tradition, but Lenica already started using collage early on, even though this is also quite a painterly poster. Brothers in Arms, a very famous film by Jean Renoir about a prisoner of war camp run by, during the First World War, run by the Germans and with French prisoners of war. And of course, these were antagonists, enemies, but there was a sort of hidden friendship that you felt it between the captors and the captives, which this poster renders. But you can see how montage was worked. So many of the elements were hand painted, then cut out, then juxtaposed and glued down to make just the right composition. Some of the posters were directly influenced by people like Max Ernst. If you know, if you're familiar with the Surrealists, Max Ernst was a German artist who moved to France and then later on to the United States, who worked very much with collage and montage. He created several books, one, the most famous of which was called The Woman with 100 Heads, cutting out diverse elements from 19th century magazines, from wood engraved illustrations, and creating a different kind of narrative. And of course, this fed through to Lenica's later films, of course, one of which we are showing here in this exhibition, Labyrinth, which was a major breakthrough and a major influence in animation. People say that it looks a lot, it reminds them of Monty Python, but of course, these films were made before Monty Python, and in fact, Terry Gilliam said that he was very much influenced by these films that he saw. Lenica at the same time was working as a satirical artist, contributing to various magazines. And these are kind of examples of stories where no comment is needed, no word is needed. I mean, it's life, isn't it? I mean, you know, the more prizes we win, the more we're decorated, knighthoods, etc. That quite often leads to us losing our individuality. We become part of the establishment, and so we're praised, but yet do we retain our independence and individuality? And I think this was very important to a person like Lenica, who, you know, again, this is a kind of angry thoughts, I think this was called. It was at the same time as in the United Kingdom, people like John Osborne and Harold Pinter were working in the theatre. They were referred to as angry young men, individuals who didn't want to conform or didn't want to bend to the sort of bureaucratic norm of everyday life. Another example of montage. This is a very interesting film, and I'll give away the ending because it's rather difficult to find this film. But it's a film in one shot. So everything is inside this one static shot, made up from old engravings, as you can see, in the style of Max Ernst. And there's this man writing a letter, making cups of tea, and then suddenly this huge letter A intrudes into his world and starts persecuting him, running after him, knocking him on the head, turning over the furniture, disrupting everything, smashing the mirror. And he tries to fight it, but to no avail. He can't get rid of it. In the end, it does disappear. It does. And he's not quite sure, and he's sort of searching behind the mirror, under the bed, etc. And then when he thinks that everything's okay, he starts to relax and water the flowers, etc., etc. And then a letter B appears. So it's again a kind of metaphor for life, you know, where we've got loads to struggle with in our life. Life is difficult, let's face it. So, of course, there are 26 letters in the alphabet. These are characters. One thing which was very rich in these films by Lenica, Borowczyk, which Terry Gilliam writes a lot about, what made them really rich was their artistic quality. But it's difficult for those of you who make animation films. You know how difficult it is. It's time consuming. You have to make hundreds of drawings. So for one individual, it's almost impossible. So studios make films, and then the compromises are made. It's difficult to control the artistic integrity of the whole film. But Lenica and Borowczyk worked with cutouts. This allowed them to create very elaborate backgrounds, very painterly backgrounds. And although the characters maybe weren't as fluid as in some of the drawn animation, more like puppets, if you like. So the movement could be staccato, although they could work with dissolves, but it allowed them for very colorful and artistically rich compositions. This is Lenica working under the rostrum camera. The film that he was making here, it was called Ubu Roi. I don't know if you're familiar with Ubu Roi. It was written by Alfred Jarry, who was a 19th to 20, on the cusp of the 19th, 20th century absurdist playwright. He wrote most of his plays when he was still a schoolboy, but they were provocative, anti-establishment. He was, I think, one of the founders of pataphysics. I kind of know what it is, but I can't explain it. So you might have to look in the dictionary to get a better notion of what pataphysics is. But anyway, it was very much to do with the absurd. So in fact, Ubu was the king of Poland. And in his time, Poland didn't exist because it was partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So he was the king of nowhere. The other sort of strength, I think, in a lot of these images that you see around you and in the films that are on view here in this exhibition, is that artists worked with very impoverished means. You know, the method of production was quite primitive. You know, now we have great sophisticated technical possibilities, particularly with digital. But even before digital with sophisticated printing equipment, etc. These artists worked with paints, black ink, sometimes a darkroom, and a pair of scissors. Scissors were often used, and of course that directly relates to montage. Lenica was in Cannes for the film festival with one of his short films, and he bumped into Roman Polanski, the filmmaker, who had just made Cul-de-sac and was promoting his film, and he wanted, and bumping into Lenica, he said, well, could you design a poster for this film of mine? And Lenica was very excited. He said, of course, when do you want it for? And he said, tomorrow. So Lenica slightly panicked, but quickly rushed out and went to a shop, bought some ink, bought some scissors, a few magazines, and produced this poster in his hotel room, you know, cutting these elements out. I think the lettering was done from a magazine, and created this very effective composition, which in fact, if you know the film, sums it up quite neatly. The rest of the typography was later on put in by the producers, and this was in fact a poster for the English distribution, because the film was made in England. Also, when working in children's books, you wouldn't think this is a montage, but if you look very closely on this slide, perhaps it's not that visible, but if you saw the artwork, you could see that each element is actually cut out. So that allows him great flexibility. You know, whether the crocodile looks better this way, that way, holds this mask, that mask, you can change these elements. It's fluid until you get just the right composition, just the right gesture, the drama of it, etc., the humor. You know, if you set out to paint a picture directly, and if you go wrong, then you can say, well, it doesn't work. I've got to paint a second picture. But if you paint these individual elements separately, some are bigger, some are smaller, you juxtapose them, you can arrive at the perfect composition. Borowczyk also made film posters, and it's very interesting to see this kind of flattening, this flat composition. You know, this is for a French film. I think it's something to do with medieval times. Sąd Boży means God's judgment. What's interesting about it is its simplicity. And when Borowczyk then made films on his own, the compositions are very similar to that kind of poster. It's flat. That's Borowczyk on the left talking to the main character he's just drawn, who then has a life of her own. It's a very interesting film, The Theatre of Monsieur and Madame Cabal. And this is, these are all the individual ingredients. So again, he could have different arms, different hands, parts of the body, which he could then easily manipulate under the rostrum camera. And some of their inspiration, as I mentioned earlier, Méliès, but also Feuillade, who made Fantomas, this kind of mysterious character in early 20th century Paris, a bit like Moriarty, you know, the man with whom Sherlock Holmes had great conflicts. That kind of flat composition, again, which you see in the above animation film, the Encyclopedia, Grandmother's Encyclopedia by Borowczyk, and then an early live-action film also with cars. And in fact, this is Borowczyk with Max Ernst. Both Borowczyk and Lenica won the Max Ernst Prize for animation, which for them was a great delight because, of course, he was a big influence on them. Borowczyk went on to make a few more animation films. These are his sort of time frame doping sheets that working out the timings of the animated characters and elements and dissolves, etc. And these are small paintings. I've seen the originals for these films. It's called the Angels' Games, Les Jeux des Anges. They're little gouache paintings, but again, they're also cutouts, another frame, using very textured backgrounds, which comes also from his early work. This is a lithograph which he made, studies of various folkloric costumes. And you see the same kind of textures in his lithographs later in his first feature film called Goto, Island of Love. And his second film was Blanche, and these are films with actors. Blanche set in medieval France. Very effective poster. The main character, Blanche, this innocent sort of queen caught up in great rivalry between different knights and noblemen. So you have that kind of medieval quality there. The third artist, because both Borowczyk and Lenica went on to make films in Paris. They left Poland for Paris. And another artist who left for Paris, but for different reasons, was Roman Cieslewicz, whose work you see on the walls here. Roman Cieslewicz also worked with collage in a similar manner. In fact, he was influenced by Jan Lenica. He admitted to that himself. But then found a more contemporary approach to montage and collage, very often using photography, big blow-ups from photographs, from magazines, from the news, bulletins, etc. But he went to Paris because he was frustrated by the actual primitive technical facilities that were available in Poland. You couldn't even use photocopiers, for instance, unless you had special permission, you know, from from the bureaucracies, because it was a communist state. So he went to Paris, where he could then, with the hope of extending his technical abilities, and very quickly became art director of Elle magazine, then Vogue magazine, testing out his illustrations, and then later doing page layouts, and then becoming the art director of the magazine itself. Later on, he art directed Opus International, which was a very important French art magazine, and later designed all the catalogs and posters and graphic publicity work for the Georges Pompidou Center. But his early posters, as you can see, also there's this evidence of working with enlarged engravings, a diverse mixture of typefaces, almost like letterpress, and being very playful. These are early film posters, and he made, in a space of 5 years, he made over 200 film posters, which was quite amazing. What I like about a lot of his design work is the directness of the image. It doesn't fuss about with too many details, you know. Quite often, people working with collage and montage, they use so many different things, so many different elements, so many detailed ingredients, that it becomes very decorative. It becomes almost like a mosaic. Whereas in the hands of someone like Cieslewicz, he only used one or two elements, intervening slightly, ripping a head off with this fire coming out. This is for The Prisoner, a contemporary Italian composer, Luigi Dalla Piccola. This is Jade. I think it's somewhere around here, isn't it? It is, yeah. Unfortunately, I've cropped off the name of the playwright, Adam Mickiewicz. But this is a very interesting poster. It's quite an important poster for several reasons. One, its design. And I think not only its pure visual impact, but its meaning, because Jade, which means the forefathers, was a play written by Adam Mickiewicz in the 19th century. He was a romantic playwright who very much was important for the country's identity, for the preservation of Poland's identity, in a period where it was partitioned by these great powers that I mentioned earlier, Russia, Germany, Austro-Hungary. And it's to do with the uprising, with one of the uprisings. There were several major uprisings, the country trying to gain back its independence. But it failed. Like all those uprisings, they failed, and people were sent off to Siberia. Every generation had a whole lot of relatives sent to Siberia. And you can see that he's made a kind of human figure out of parched earth, scorched earth, with its heart ripped out of it. So it was a very poignant sort of image, which actually was even more important in those days, because this came out in May 1968, and the play was deemed by the authorities to be too anti-Russian. And of course, the Russians were great socialist communist friends of Poland. So it was taken off. It was taken down. The play was no longer staged, and students rioted because of this. They walked out of all universities and the art academy as well, of course. It was a very dramatic time. Now Cieslewicz, although he was a real exception because of working with photography, whereas others still worked very much with the paintbrush. There were others who experimented with photography in a very expressive way, like Wojciech Zamecznik. This is for a film called The Train. And perhaps a much neglected graphic designer, Bronisław Zelek, who later went on to work in Austria, in Vienna. Here, this is a great example of Montage using typography in a very dynamic and very aggressive, dramatic way. The poster on the left is for a Swedish film called, or Danish film called Hunger, based on Knut Hamsun's famous novel. And of course, on the right, a poster for Hitchcock's The Birds. So different to what we're used to seeing on posters in the West. So it's a very individual kind of interpretation. And this is Zamecznik again, Mondo Cane, which was a kind of documentary, Italian documentary film, anthropological film. Cieslewicz, of course, when he came to Paris, he had great problems with working in a similar fashion. He didn't have the same freedom when working with film posters, but he did manage to do one or two, design one or two, like this one for L'Attentat. And the man you see kneeling down here with a bald head is Henryk Tomaszewski. Very important character, one of the most interesting poster designers in Poland, very painterly, but also a fantastic teacher and pedagogue. This is him in the Academy of Fine Art, where I studied. And he gave students very challenging projects to do in poster design. He set subjects such as in unity there's strength, and you had to design a poster based on that notion, or in one image create the idea of a big nothing and a small nothing. Very difficult to do, but very challenging. And the students had to do loads of sketches in proportion to the final format, drawings, little sketches, until something worked, until he was quite pleased with the concept. Big discussions, whether it makes any sense, what's the logic behind it, is it provocative enough? And once a sketch was approved, then the student could go on to make the poster itself, which was painted same size, like on the left, you know, on an easel in a traditional fashion. But even then, students brought in these elements, these parts of the poster, and pinned them with pins. During the crit, there was still the possibility of changing the composition, of emphasizing one thing or another. And of course, Tomaszewski emphasized the fact that you should never think of the typography as an addition to the picture. Because of course, as you can see in many of these posters, the image is predominant in Polish graphics. But to think of just adding the type at the end is a mistake. It has to be, it's an integral part, sometimes even maybe more important than the picture. Here is Tomaszewski repositioning things. In fact, this is me with Tomaszewski. Little did I know that I'd have a similar haircut to him many years later. And him outside the academy. You know, you gather that I like him very much. I like him because I've been showing you his image quite a bit. But it's interesting because, as I mentioned with this poster for Jade, for the forefathers, which initiated these student riots in 1968, the students, there was a stage set up on this grass, on this lawn in between, there was a sort of courtyard to the academy itself, which was a very beautiful sort of palatial building. And the students were lectured to by the authorities that they had a choice. Either, you can either stay out and protest, or you go back in. If you stay out, you get thrown out, you get expelled. But if you go back and don't manifest, then you're accepted back into your studies. One of the main professors was really scathing with the students. He spoke for over an hour, slamming them, criticizing them. And his name was Professor Damski. Dama in Polish is a lady, dam in French, it comes from the French word. But Damski would mean of a ladies, ladies, apostrophe S. And he spoke, etc., etc. And then it was the turn of Henryk Tomaszewski to say something. And he said just one sentence. I'll tell it to you in Polish and then I'll translate. He said, "Widziałem wiele chujów w swoim życiu, ale nigdy damskiego," which means I've seen many pricks in my life, but never a ladies. and that was very typical of him. He wasn't a party member, so he was risking a lot, but he was so much respected that they wouldn't touch him. They wouldn't touch him. So, generations of artists had great affection for him, even though he was quite frightening. He could be tough. Not very good reproduction, but this is a poster of his I found by chance, reproduced somewhere in a book, not very well known. It's for a festival of silent movies. You may recognize. I think this is the Battleship Potemkin, I think, by Eisenstein. But why I'm showing it to you, because it's kind of divided into all these segments, so it kind of reflects the sort of film strip. But also, he set us similar projects that we had to depict countries in 5 pictures, but forming a unity as well. So, a difficult thing. 5 pictures, but yet a whole coherent composition. So it's an example of how his own experiments then affected his teaching. And of course, we go back to the word montage. And even in these painterly compositions, you can see that these elements, are cut out and then assembled together. This is more typical of his later posters, even more simpler. Again, to do with these terrible 19th century romantic uprisings which failed. And Juliusz Słowacki was also a romantic poet. This depicts the despair, these black crows and the snow of Siberia. And an example of his cheek, because this poster actually is for a cabaret, but what's important about it is the date, 1983, or 82, I think, 82, shortly after martial law was declared in Poland. For those who aren't familiar with that history, free trade unions were established in 1980 in Poland, 1981, and Lech Wałęsa was leading shipyard worker who was their president. And things were breaking, communism was fracturing, it was breaking up. So it was threatened. Martial law was declared then. Tanks came out on the streets. Dissidents went to prison. Intellectuals were restricted, were censored, and many things were forbidden. Even the sort of victory sign, which you may have seen on newsreels, where the shipyard workers were always going like this, we've won, we formed our free trade unions, and that was banned. But of course, Tomaszewski found a way around it. He did the victory sign with his foot, and the censor couldn't do anything about it. I mean, you can't censor it. And and this kind of humor came from these satirical drawings that, in fact, most of these designers had their roots in. This is a picture. This is a drawing called the history of the world in 2 pictures. And this one is called "If I Knew What's Facing Me in Life, I'd Sit Down." I can show you a few things that I myself do, pretty much initially under the influence of these very exciting designers and artists that we see in this exhibition. I wanted to show you this one. This I made, I think, in the 1990s when I had already returned to England for an arts foundation called Gustav Mahler and the 21st Century. It was called Gustav Mahler because it was run by Gustav Mahler's granddaughter, and she set up a lot of money and a foundation for promoting young art, and particularly music, in Spoleto in Italy. It's an example of simplicity and not using too many ingredients to do an effective and eye-catching composition. So these are the only ingredients I had. I photographed my daughter at that time, took a fragment of a Brancusi sculpture, and this aerial image of a city. So those were the only ingredients. And this kind of notion of montage I carried also into narrative. This is a book of mine called The Secret. It's without words, so it's a kind of novella, really, a story, but it's based on the idea of camera, the camera obscura, which is, of course, a camera room. If you have a hole, if we had daylight coming from here and just a hole in here, we would see the image of the outside world projected upside down on the wall opposite. And the pinhole camera, which many of you most probably are familiar with, a box camera without a lens. And why I'm showing you this is simply because it's actually drawn quite traditionally with ink, and it's set at the time of Christmas, where the kids are given presents. The little boy is given a pinhole camera, which his father has made for him, and together they photograph the boy's mother and his sister. And as it progresses, I won't dwell too long on it, but you can have a look at the book if you want to. The man, later when the kids are put to bed, he goes out to buy some cigarettes, and he comes back, and when he comes back, his family have vanished. They've disappeared. So he phones many people, goes to the... first of all, he actually looks across the courtyard to the flat opposite, and sees some strange silhouette with a box-like object. He goes and investigates. The woman, that's a woman actually, says that she knows nothing about any disappearance in his family, etc., etc. He goes to the police to ask, gives them a photograph of his wife, but to no avail. And then there's a whole chapter about his neighbors who are up to something. In the meantime, time passes and he really goes to pieces. You know, he stops shaving. He can't cope with this situation, and he starts to hit the bottle and starts to hallucinate, seeing grasshoppers with human heads, etc. And this grasshopper jumps across, and then he sees these silhouettes again of his neighbors who project something onto, let's say, a bat, and as a result of which it vanishes. So they're kind of projecting, photographing, we don't quite know. When they have gone, he follows them to the zoo where they do more experiments. He comes back before they return to their flat to investigate and looks into their box camera. And inside the box camera is his wife. Actually, it's my wife, but it's his wife. But you see, and why I'm showing you this is because everything registered by the camera is collaged, it's montaged, it's done from photographic things, whilst the story itself is narrated through simple drawings. So he's shocked, falls back, retreats back through these double doors and sees the exact same room that he saw his wife trapped in. And this progresses. This is the only montage collage I've done on a computer. Because it's together with my wife, Danusia Szejbal, we did a graphic novel adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's Scottish guy, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and we did a kind of a dissolve of both our drawings. The moment when of course Dr. Jekyll is undergoing this transformation due to his experiments with drugs, and the fact is, you know, this is for an exhibition I had, but it's kind of symbolic of the closeness of myself and my wife. Although we're independent artists, she works in the theater, or worked in the theater as a set designer, costume designer, but also as my model kind of muse. But that kind of overlapping is kind of symbolized in this poster. Of course, earlier on when I was making posters, using collage, using photomontage, I also used my wife as a model. This is for Nashville, a film you may know, a musical. Then when my son was born, he started posing for me. So this is for The Omen, a horror film about a boy being possessed by the devil. So you know, I just took a photograph of Dominique naked and just added this fragment of an engraving which I found in I can't remember where now, but so it's an example of just sometimes all you need really is just two elements, and that's all. Like this one for Samuel Beckett's Not I. I don't know if you're familiar with the play. It's a very, very dramatic play in which just a mouth appears on the stage, intensely lit, and rattles off this amazing dialogue. It's a very difficult thing for an actor to perform, but it was beautifully done by Billy Whitelaw at the Royal Court Theatre in the early 70s. But it was staged in Poland, and so I photographed my wife's mouth, and this is just a fragment of the dialogue behind it. You know, also, you know, I mentioned the sort of poverty of means, not using too sophisticated materials. This is a poster for Moses and Aaron. The German opera from Düsseldorf came to Warsaw and commissioned this poster from me. It was just 2 performances, and they printed this poster, very good production values. But I had to come up with something very fast, and I asked Danusia, who's a costume designer, can you come up with something which would reflect this, this Old Testament kind of based opera, which is to do with paganism and the golden calf, orgiastic kind of situation. And so she just put a few scarves around her, and we've photographed it and montaged it together with fragments of engravings, which I took from I'm not sure which sources. Again, maybe Gustave Doré, I think it was. Then when my son got older, he carried on working for me. But here I worked a lot with photography and processing it through the darkroom, etc. But Milan Kundera wrote this book called Life is Elsewhere, which is about a sort of ambitious young poet who's actually pushed by his mother, because he wasn't all that, he didn't really want to make a huge career, but his mother was very ambitious for him, and so he's in her clutches there. And I went on to do a lot of Kundera covers. His novels are very erotic, quite political. But of course, another thing which collage offers, which you can see in Cieslewicz's work a lot, is an element of chance. Many of the images I've shown you just a while ago were generated by me. I had certain concepts, certain ideas how to interpret a theme. So I took photographs, I set them up, and then I montaged them. Sometimes I wouldn't have any ideas, I wouldn't photograph anything, but I looked through material, you know, because sometimes we don't have ideas, you know, we just don't. They don't come. And I find that the way to maybe compensate for that is to look through a lot of material. And as you're looking through these images, something sparks off an idea, you know. So, for instance, here for the Trupp in the Opera by Bertolt Brecht, I saw one or two photographs with, and in the background there were these actresses or actors with heavy eye makeup, you know, eyeshadow like you had in the 1920s, in the sort of roaring 20s, early 30s, decadent Berlin. So that's why you have this very coarse screen, you know, half-dot screen, because I blew it up. I mean, the artwork was that big originally, you see, so blowing it up allowed that sort of texture to be emphasized. Similarly, for Taxi Driver, I wasn't quite sure what to do, so I looked through stills, which were available at that time for my disposition. Similarly, in Down by Law, which is very much to do with these, it's about these three prisoners who make an escape, but they can't, they're tied together somehow. They can't operate on their own. So I have these hands holding them together. A similar approach to Jim Jarmusch's Mystery Train, and then a wonderful kind of commission. I had to design all the covers for Harold Pinter. He actually chose me as the illustrator to do these things for Faber and Faber, and we got on very well together because he's also quite, he doesn't embellish too much. His plays are rather pared down, quite austere, loads of pauses. I think people refer to his dialogue as full of pregnant pauses. And I'm ending on this one, which is another book I did with my wife. This time this is her drawing, montage together, as a robot would be, put together with bits of metal, etc.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on, and thank you very much for coming, and my great pleasure to having Andrew here, and thank you very much for this fantastic talk and very stimulating.
Thank you very much.
Should we give a round of applause?